And it's our job to take care of old churches that aren't used for regular Sunday prayers anymore. And Holy Trinity is one of those churches. Now, because Holy Trinity isn't used for regular Sunday church services, it's our job to try and find other uses for the building. And one of the best uses I can think of for a beautiful, historic, wonderful, inspiring building like this one is to use it basically as a classroom, to get people in, students like yourselves, into this building and use it as a space to inspire you and teach you and just basically give you a really unique and interesting experience for your learning. So that's why you've come to us today. You've come to us today to do some learning, but that learning is going to be interesting and unique and hopefully quite fun as well. Now, what we're going to learn about is the work of this man. Now, does anybody recognize that picture? Do you know who this chap is? At the back there, what's his name? William Shakespeare. Well done, you recognize him. Who can tell me, I just said we're going to learn about his work today. Who can tell me, what was his job? What did William Shakespeare do for a living? He wrote plays, exactly right. He was a playwright, a poet as well. He wrote poems, and often his plays incorporate poetry in them. William Shakespeare lived a long time ago. He wrote his poems and plays a long time ago. Does anybody know approximately how many years ago he lived? You don't have to be exact. Do you have a guess? Not quite 600. It is definitely in the hundreds, though. Do you want to have a go? Well, yes, he was born in Elizabethan times when Queen Elizabeth I was the ruler of England. Do you know how many hundred of years ago that was?
Like over 400.
Yeah, just over 400. He was actually born 451 years ago this month. So you are here at Holy Trinity today to learn about the works of William Shakespeare, a poet and playwright who was born in Elizabethan times 451 years ago. Now at this point you might be thinking, why have we come to a church to learn about William Shakespeare? There's actually quite a few good reasons for coming to this church in particular to learn about Shakespeare. Now, the first reason is the fact that this building has a lot in common with theatres, the sorts of theatres where Shakespeare's plays would have been performed. If you think about it, both a church and a theatre are big buildings with seating for a lot of people. When you go into a theatre, you have all those seats where the audience can sit during the performance. You come into a church like this one, you have all of these special seats, these benches called pews, and that's where the audience, which we call the congregation in a church, sits. So both a theatre and a church are a place where large groups of people assemble and sit down to watch something. In a play, the audience is watching actors perform. In a church, the congregation is watching a vicar recite his or her sermon, reading lines from the Bible, teaching their lessons. So you've got buildings where large groups of people assemble, there's seating for those groups of people, they're looking forward at somebody performing or speaking. Now, the actors themselves, the actors wear costumes. Costumes can be used to identify what characters they are playing. A vicar or a priest in a church wears a traditional robe or gown to identify him or her as the vicar. So there's that similarity between the special clothing or costumes that the people wear within the two buildings. And in a theatre, you usually have a place that's raised up at the front of the building, the thing that we call a stage, and that's where the actors perform. Here in a church, you can see it's very similar. At the front of this church, there's a raised up area. It's called the chancel, and that's where the vicar stands when he or she is delivering their sermon. So that's the first reason for staging this Shakespeare workshop at this church today, because churches and theatres where Shakespeare's plays were performed have a lot in common. Now there's a couple other reasons why this church makes a good place to learn about Shakespeare. First of those additional reasons is the fact that this building actually housed the very first library in Sunderland. Did any of you know that? No? Holy Trinity is the oldest church in Sunderland. It's almost 300 years old. But in the past, it wasn't just used as a church. It had lots of other uses as well. One of those uses was a library. Now, it wasn't the whole building filled with books. The library was in one of the rooms upstairs, and you're all going to get a chance to do some work in the library during your visit today. So that's a good reason for learning about Shakespeare in this building, because I'd be willing to bet that maybe 100 or 200 years ago, the printed works of Shakespeare, his plays in book form, would have been on the shelves of that library. People could have come in and read Shakespeare's works right in this very building. And the last reason I'm going to give to you for why this makes a good place to learn about Shakespeare is the downstairs room, just below the library at the back of the church. Another room that you're all going to get a chance to visit today was the old council chambers. So that's another use that this building had. The local government officials used to meet here. They met in the old council chambers, and that's where they would decide things like rules and regulations and bylaws, how people in Sunderland should behave, what rules people should live by, and what to do with those people when they broke those rules. Now, we're going to be learning about one particular Shakespeare play today. That Shakespeare play is, do you know what play it is that we're focusing on? Very well prepared. What is it? Macbeth. Have you read the story of Macbeth before? Yeah. Do all of you know the story? So you know that it is a story about breaking rules, isn't it? There's a lot of crimes being committed in that particular play. So that's why I think this building makes a good place to learn about not just Shakespeare, but Macbeth in particular. In that old council chamber, that's a great place to consider who was guilty of the crimes in Macbeth and who might have been innocent of those crimes. So, have I convinced you? Do you think that this church is a good place to come to learn about Shakespeare and his play Macbeth? Excellent. So now you say that you already know a bit about the play. So the character of Macbeth, do you know, at the very beginning of the play, do you know what his job was before all the murder and mayhem starts up? What was Macbeth's job at the very beginning of the play? Yeah, he's a general in the army of the Scottish king. Of course, Macbeth, the play, takes place in medieval times, before Scotland and England were unified under one king or queen. So, in the play Macbeth, it opens, Macbeth is a general, he's fighting in the army of the Scottish king. And do you know the Scottish king's name? Starts with Duncan. So, as the play opens, Macbeth is not just fighting in a battle on behalf of King Duncan, he's winning that battle. He has just led his troops to a great victory against Duncan's enemies. King Duncan is very, very proud of Macbeth as his star general. He agrees to go and spend some time with Macbeth and Macbeth's wife, Lady Macbeth, at their castle in celebration. On the way back to the castle, though, Macbeth encounters three rather strange characters. Do you know who they are, what they're called? Do you know who they are? The three witches, that's right. Now, they're sometimes called the three witches, and they're sometimes called something else, the three... Does anybody know another name for them?
Three hags.
Well, hags is a good way to describe them. They're sort of sinister, old, sort of crouched over, hairy, icky, kind of creepy women. So hag would be a good word to describe them. Shakespeare himself, he calls them the three weird sisters. So, as we're doing our activities today, when you're talking about the weird sisters, we're talking about the three witches. The three weird sisters tell Macbeth that they have seen the future, and in that future, he will be the king of Scotland. And almost immediately, Macbeth shocks and surprises himself by thinking some rather treacherous and terrible thoughts. He thinks, I don't know, I think I might kind of like being king, and how could I become king when King Duncan is around? I can murder him. That thought surprises him. Macbeth thinks, I've always loved King Duncan, I've always been loyal to him, how could I think such thoughts? And he's very upset by this treacherous thought he's had. So he tells his wife about it. He tells her both about the prophecy and about his wicked thoughts, his thoughts of murdering King Duncan. How does Lady Macbeth respond? Does she go, oh my dear, how could you think such terrible things? Or does she think, oh my dear, that sounds like a good plan? What's her response? What does Lady Macbeth say?
It's just that King Duncan's cousin to Macbeth. In one of the books it says he's cousin to him.
Oh, I don't know. You know it in much more detail than I know. For today's purposes, we don't need to know. That's something I will look into, though. Caught me up there. All right, so let's get back to Lady Macbeth. Does she think the idea of murdering King Duncan is a good idea or a bad idea? A good idea, because she really wants to be queen. She wants all the power and the glory and the money that would go with being queen. So she actually says to her husband, that's not such a bad idea after all. She helps him to plot the murder of the king, and she even helps him to carry it out. After the murder, when Macbeth becomes king himself, he's a little bit unsettled, isn't he? He's now starting to worry, wait a minute, if I could kill Duncan to take his throne from him, maybe somebody else is out to get me. He starts to get a little bit paranoid, a little bit crazy about things. He goes back to the three weird sisters. He says, is there any threat being posed to me? Is my throne secure, or should I be worried? And they conjure up three apparitions, three visions, which seem to say, no, there's no threat against you, Macbeth. But in actual fact, they're veiled threats, they're disguised dangers, as we find out as we continue reading the play, don't we? Macbeth continues to grow madder and madder as you go from scene to scene, and he just starts killing anyone and everyone who he thinks might be a threat to his throne. And while he grows madder and murders more and more people, his wife goes mad as well. Lady Macbeth ends up taking her own life. She commits suicide. She can't deal with the guilt anymore. She's sleepwalking in her sleep. She's trying to wash the blood off her hands. She can't wash it off. That's the guilt that she can't get rid of. Her life ends tragically. And Macbeth, his life ends tragically as well, because his former comrades, his former friends, now recognize the threat he poses, not only to the stability of Scotland, but also the threat he poses to them. He could kill his old friends, as he already has done to some of them. So in the end, they join forces, they depose Macbeth, they kill the king, and they stop the murder, the madness, and the mayhem. So that's the play in a nutshell. What we're going to do now is split you into three groups, and you're going to rotate around three activity centers, where you're going to explore the characters of Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, and the Weird Sisters in a little bit more detail.
Does anyone mind having an update? Yeah, Mr. Corner.
Mr. Cook did come dressed up. He was
Very good. There was confidence.
I can kill King Duncan, and his servants, and it was I who commanded the murders of the others.
Yeah?
I would say Lady Macbeth, because with her wanting to go on the throne, should obviously Macbeth didn't need to commit murder.
Time for a couple more?
I still think Lady Macbeth was a fool.
All right. We still have, we've got those diehard supporters of the individual characters. What would you like to say?
I found it really interesting because I didn't know anything about Macbeth, and I've learned quite a lot about it today.
And do you think you might go away and read the play of Macbeth now? Do you think it's a play that you'd like to either see performed or read for yourself now? That is brilliant. I'm going to leave it at that.